Good afternoon. My name is Chris Steinke. Welcome to the Brown Bag History Lecture Series sponsored by the History Department of the University of Nebraska at Kearney. The series is offered in partnership with History Nebraska, the new public face of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Lectures are held on the second Wednesday in selected months at the Kearney Public Library. The schedule for this series, as well as information about all of the History Department's programs, can be found at www.unk.edu/academics/history. Please try to head to this webpage to learn more about History Nebraska and its programs and services. That address is history.nebraska.gov. If you are not already a member of History Nebraska, I encourage you to join. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the UNK History Department and the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs. If you'd like to watch any of the 170 plus previous Brown Bag lectures, please visit the History Nebraska YouTube page at youtube.com/historynebraska. See playlists. There you can see a subsection labeled Brown Bag Lectures. Our topic today is the Kearney War, Cowboys, Settlers, and Community Conflict on the Platte Valley Frontier, 1870 to 1885. And our featured speaker is Mark R. Ellis. Dr. Ellis is a history professor and interim graduate dean at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. His research focuses on the legal history of the American frontier. He's written numerous articles on frontier law and order, and is the author of Law and Order in Buffalo Bill's Country, Legal Culture, and Community on the Great Plains, 1867 to 1910. Dr. Ellis will be happy to answer questions at the conclusion of his talk, and there are a couple microphones set up for the Q&A at the end. Look forward to hearing from Dr. Ellis. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks for the introduction, Chris. Thanks to the library for hosting, and the History Department and Nebraska Historical Society for sponsoring these events. This morning I realized I probably put way too much into this lecture. I had about 4 hours of material. So you guys don't want to wait around that long. So I have pared it back, made some shortcuts. What we're going to look at today is the conflict between settlers and cowboys, or I should point out herders. The term cowboy that we know of is a much later term. In the 1870s, you would have either heard drover, bullwhacker, or herder was the more typical term. Cowboy starts appearing in the 1880s, but it's really a product of post-1900. But what we're going to look at is what happened right here in this community in the 1870s, just a block and a half from here. In 1874-75, cowboys and settlers were involved in shootouts, shooting at each other. There was an infamous murder just south of town here that led to posses tracking down cowboys and bringing them back for trial. A whole host of interesting people visited Kearney during this period. There was a cowboy by the name of Billy Bland who was wounded here in Kearney and will eventually be killed at Fort Griffith, Texas. A man by the name of Texas Spence was killed just down on Central Avenue here. Frederick Roxy Copeland, Mexican Joe Mitchell, and Bert Yank Brown were all involved in a murder here, eventually put on trial and exonerated. And Doc Smith, the ringleader of a cowboy group, will end up spending time in the state prison. The Kearney War is one chapter of a larger book I'm writing that I've tentatively called The Cowboy Menace, because settlers here in Nebraska viewed these visitors as outsiders and essentially a menace to their own settlements. So I call it the Cowboy Menace. There's about 7-8 chapters. I'll review each of those with you here in a second. But what this does is it builds upon my earlier work, this book here, Law and Order in Buffalo Bill's Country. But what this book did is I looked at the frontier, the Nebraska frontier, and there's two broad conclusions. One conclusion is that settlers to the Nebraska frontier brought with them a legal culture, an understanding of how the law operated that allowed, even on the frontier, law to function. As a result of that, we saw far less crime and violence. That was my argument in this book. If there's any students here You'll know that historians eventually revise each other. We don't like to revise ourselves, but I'm going to have to do that. Because 10 years later, after this is published, my new research suggests that only 2 of my conclusions might have been correct. Yes, settlers brought a legal culture with them that allowed the law to operate, but that didn't necessarily lead to lower levels of violence, as we'll see in some of these incidents I'm going to outline today. So this book, The Cowboy Menace, and by the way, it's a few years from being finished. It's kind of stalled out here over the last few years with some other assignments. But you can see here sort of some of the creative chapters I've come up with. The Cowboy Comes to Nebraska, A Terror to Evil-Doers, the Kearney War, which is what we'll talk about today, the Man Burners, Those Cowboy Killers, Queen of the Cattle Towns, and King of the Horse Thieves. There's another one that's the last one is called The Fence Cutters. So just briefly, in chapter 1, I'll outline how cowboys ended up in Nebraska. Long story short, a lot of cattle were in Texas. The end of the Civil War led to markets for cattle in northern markets, eastern markets. Enterprising cattlemen drove their cattle to Kansas and eventually into Nebraska. And so we saw a series of cattle towns, the first one at Schuyler, Nebraska. And then as the farmers' frontier overtook that, Kearney Junction, where we sit today. That was short-lived. After 2 years, it moved on briefly to North Platte and eventually to the queen of the cattle towns, Ogallala. The next chapter outlines the legal situation in western Nebraska, and it really focuses around this guy, Judge William Gaslin, whose nickname was a terror to evildoers. He doesn't look like it, does he? But he literally was. He tried 68 murder trials. He was rumored to have put a Winchester or Colt revolvers on the bench as a sort of a warning. He always gave out the stiffest sentence possible. And he maybe wasn't such a good judge because a whole bunch of his cases were overturned by the Supreme Court. But nonetheless, Judge William Gaslin, terror to evildoers. The next chapter would have been the Kearney War. This is a horrific picture, by the way, and I'll just briefly touch on this. This was known as the Man Burner case. It grew out of Custer County, where we saw this feud between large cattlemen, essentially the Print brothers and the Olive brothers and their operation, against homesteaders. There was cattle rustling going on, there was violence, there was intimidation. It eventually led to the lynching, murder, and burning of 2 homesteaders. The picture on the right is their bodies. They were actually brought here to Kearney. That picture was taken right out on what today is Central Avenue. Horrible picture. The next chapter will be on Ogallala itself, the queen of the cattle towns, from about 1875 to 1885. This is where large numbers of cattle were driven and where cowboys were allowed to participate in vice industries and wild and woolly behavior and allowed to kill each other if they chose. It was only when they killed non-cowboys is when we had a problem. This is an interesting case. The Cowboy Killers, the 2 men that are standing, Matt Zimmerman and Milt Coleman, I think. Heavily armed cowboys in a Minden eatery. Sheriff Jack Woods of Hitchcock County goes in to arrest them for horse thief. They open fire, kill the sheriff, kill 2 citizens. They escape into Kansas. Massive manhunt. Long story short, the guy on the right, the tall guy, is killed. The guy on the left is brought back, put on trial in Judge Gaslin's court. He'll be convicted, sentenced to death, and then on the technicality, he'll be released, and he escapes and disappears into history. King of the Horse Thieves. This is Doc Middleton and his half-brother, Texas Charlie Fugate. Horse thieves, cattlemen, but also they really took on this image almost of a Robin Hood figure. There'll be a massive manhunt to track them down, and Texas Charlie will actually be killed in South Dakota. The guy on the left will be imprisoned. And finally, the fence cutters. In the 1880s, cattlemen in Custer County and Sand Hills in general fenced off an incredible amount of federal land. I mean, thousands of square acres of land in order to keep it out of homesteaders' hands. This made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and those cattlemen were forced to take down the fences. And it was only made possible with the invention of barbed wire, because you could put so many hundreds of miles of fences up. Okay, now we're to chapter 3 of this book, and that's the Kearney War. It wasn't a long, drawn-out war. We're talking 1873 to 1875. A handful of events, but it became known as the Kearney Riot or the Kearney War or the Texas Invasion, all these different terms. I settled on the Kearney War. Catchy title. It got a lot of you to come out today. Thanks for coming. Kearney was founded in 1872. Its original name was Kearney Junction because it junctioned the Union Pacific Railroad and the Burlington Railroad junctioned right where we are today. And for a long time, the Cowboys themselves called it the Junction. We're going to the Junction. But it quickly became a hot point. People across the Midwest thought that Kearney is the new hot spot. And as we're going to see, overnight, we see settlers pouring in. For example, the Burlington arrives in 1872, December of 1872. By March of 1873, there's almost 500 people living here. There's 2 newspapers, churches, schools already in place. By the end of 1873, we have about 600 to 800 people. And by the end of 1874, over 1,000 people. And so they're pouring in here. They see this as a place to bring families, to settle, to open up businesses, to practice law, to make a living. And here are some early reports that I've taken out of the newspaper just to show you that Kearney's kind of on the map. People are thinking about it. The Sioux City Journal says, Kearney Junction contains 50 houses, all constructed within the past 2 months. Indianapolis Sentinel, and these are national papers. The removal of the capital from Lincoln, Nebraska to some point further west, probably Kearney Junction, is being agitated. The Cincinnati Daily Times, Kearney Junction, 191 miles west of Omaha, is destined to make a good town. In March of 1873, Kearney Junction seems to be the rage, and everywhere the cry was, hot for Kearney Junction. Kearney Junction is evidently destined to be a brisk town. But as you peel back those layers, you see some examples of maybe there's some other things going on in Kearney. For example, March 1873 in the Washington Critic, Kearney Junction, Nebraska is the wickedest place in the West. All buildings seem to be saloons made of cottonwood with stovepipes through the roofs. So there's other things going on here as well. Finally, the Daily Nebraska Press, Kearney Junction is a live town. And oldest picture I've ever found of Kearney, this is Central Avenue. It was originally called Wyoming Avenue. It's looking north on the south side of the tracks. If you stepped outside of maybe Dad's Tavern or the Knights of Columbus, that's right where you're looking north. And it has that sort of feel of a frontier town. The bridge across the Platte, completed in 1874, connected Kearney to the Republican River Valley, again leading to more trade, more population. These maps here are important to understanding the conflict that took place with cowboys. This map here depicts the area before the railroads have junctioned. Kearney Junction, where we live today, doesn't exist. Instead, you see over here, this was Kearney Station, directly north of Fort Kearney. It's where today Buda is. It became Buda later on. Buda doesn't really, there's nothing really there anymore, out by the airport. Down here you see Kearney Center. This was just off the Fort Kearney Military Reservation. It was essentially a supply post, at first for the overland trail, eventually for the fort. Its main purpose was vice industries, though, drinking, prostitution, and such. What happens then if you look at the other map? This is 1872. The Burlington Railroad, south of the Platte River, has junctioned in with the Union Pacific, creating Kearney Junction. No longer does Kearney Station exist. No longer does Kearney Center exist. What happened is all the vice industries from Dobytown moved to the new junction point. And that's why we heard those phrases, the wickedest town in the West. There's all of these saloons there and so forth. So that's one of the issues. Also, the other issue here is that Fort Kearney Military Reservation, it's a 10 by 10 mile square, owned by the federal government. Settlers, permanent settlers, are not allowed to settle on it, but citizens are allowed to utilize it. So homesteaders aren't on that swath of land, but cattlemen can drive their cattle there, graze them on that land to fatten them up before they take them to market. So what we have then is this situation where Settlers are filling in, homesteaders. Kearney Junction's being built, but there's this open spot of land here where cattlemen can bring those cattle, and we're going to have these conflicts between the two cultures. So why do we see these conflicts? Several different reasons. First of all, there's going to be this clash of cultures. Northerners versus Southerners. Families versus young men. Different concepts of how we use land. And remember, this is just 8 years after the Civil War. There's still these animosities out there, still these ill feelings. So in a nutshell, these are just generalities here. Many of them moved to Kearney Junction, that moved to Nebraska to stay permanently. Primarily, they were from the Ohio River Valley, from the Midwest. They were from Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, a good number of New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians, and eventually a large number of immigrants, European immigrants, from Scandinavia, from Germany, from Russia, and so forth. Many of them came as families. They came as middle class because it was expensive to give up everything in Iowa, move here, build a business, build a farm, whatever it was. It wasn't for the lower class. So these are middle class families. And they came here to stay and to develop communities like Kearney Junction. Many of them were Union veterans or, without a doubt, Union sympathizers. And they viewed then Kearney as this place to stay. This was home. Other side of the coin here, we have our cowboys or herders. Not always, but mostly from Texas or from southern states. A lot from Missouri as well. They were transients. They weren't coming here to stay. They were pushing herds to the railheads or up to the Native American reservations, so the Lakota reservations, always from the lower class. A cowboy was not a glamorous job. It was a low-end job. It was for Native Americans, for Mexican Americans, for African Americans, and for very poor whites. So they were multi-ethnic, multi-racial, and not always, but a large number of Confederate sympathizers. Most of these cowboys would have been too young to have served in the Civil War because they're 16 to 21 years old, and this is 1873 to 76. So for them, Kearney Junction wasn't a place to stay. It was a place to rest, to recuperate, and to recreate, right? They came for the gambling, mostly for the drinking and the prostitution that existed here in Kearney Junction. So here's some of Kearney's early pioneers. As I said, they're middle class, they're businessmen. George Smith and his brother were two of the first settlers here. They owned a huge real estate broker business. So they needed a stable community to convince people to come and buy land, buy lots. So they had an interest here. Our second guy here is David Anderson, 3 or 4 term sheriff. He was a Union veteran who became a notable frontier sheriff. He'll appear in 2 or 3 of my chapters, sometimes as the good guy, sometimes as maybe a questionable character. A.L. Webb owned a farm implement business, very wealthy, mayor of Kearney eventually. And the guy on the far right was John Rowe, better known as Colonel Rowe. He had served in the New York infantry during the Civil War, fought at Fredericksburg, fought at Gettysburg, wounded at Gettysburg. So we have these guys with military experience. And my favorite guy is Frank Hamer. Born and reared in Ohio, in Indiana, becomes a lawyer. He was a pioneer lawyer in Lincoln, but he was too late getting there. Lincoln had already flourished. There were already 30 lawyers there. He didn't have the business. Right when Kearney Junction is in the news, boom, go to Kearney. He comes here and becomes the very first lawyer, young man at the time, and also somewhat of a scrapper, a fighter. There's an incident in 1874 when there's some cowboys being out of hand, being loud, being rude in front of families. And Frank Hamer rolls up his sleeves, walks up to the group of 4 or 5 of them and says, basically challenges them to a fist fight, one at a time. They turned him down. I don't know the circumstances behind it, but here that was Frank Hamer in an earlier era. Eventually, Frank Hamer becomes a district court judge and a Nebraska Supreme Court judge. So from right here in frontier Kearney. And I just put this photo in there to sort of show you, this is probably 10 years after the Kearney War, but it kind of reflects the civic nature of the town itself. You can see some brick buildings are appearing. This is the Low building. It still exists today on the corner of Railroad and Central. And here's the city band. And so you get this idea then that there's these folks moving here, this is their town, and they're going to want to protect it eventually. And here's the Cowboys. Now I should point out that plenty of good people among the Cowboys. There was these few folks that made things miserable for local citizens, which is why I'm a little leery of calling the book The Cowboy Menace, because it sort of suggests that they're all problem causers, and that's not the case. The two photos on the right were just general photos. They have nothing to do with Kearney other than, Cowboys came here. The guys here on the left, as I pointed out already, they will be involved in a murder of a sheriff here in Minden in Kearney County. And I just put this in to show you we have a problem here. We have two competing cultures. It's the same piece of land that one group wants to put crops on and the other wants to run cattle on. They don't mix. Here's another issue, and this is the idea of how are we going to use the land. And so we got to briefly consider fencing laws. When we say fence out laws, that means we fence out the livestock or fence in the crops, right? So farmers were obligated to keep a fence around their land. If they could prove that they had a legitimate fence, they would have a lawsuit against cattlemen. So in Texas, we had fence out laws, which is the open range. Farmers would have fenced their crops in. Cattlemen would have just had their cattle roaming at large. Nebraska, very much an agricultural state, especially by 1871, will use those agricultural friendly fence laws, such as the fence-in laws. What that meant is that cattle, livestock had to be fenced in. And the burden of proof was on them. They had to make sure their fence was legitimate, and farmers simply had to, they had no fencing obligations. So in the Nebraska Herd Law of 1871, that's exactly what happened. The obligation was put on livestock owners. And if a farmer's crops were damaged, the farmer had the right to corral in that livestock and hold that livestock until expenses were paid. And that's going to lead to a murder here in Kearney. This map I simply put in there to show you that quickly advancing agricultural frontier. It's moving east to west very quickly. And you can see right down the middle of the map is basically where we live today, between Buffalo and Dawson County. You can see where it becomes more thinly populated. This is about 1880. But the agricultural frontier is filling up, and cattlemen will no longer be able to push their cattle into Nebraska eventually, which is why they'll eventually end up out here at Oglala, and this why it'll stay as the sort of the queen of the cattle towns for many years. And this is that map that shows Buffalo County, and you can still see the Fort Kearney Military Reservation. So it's open to cattlemen. They can have their cattle there, but all around are these towns appearing, and so it's becoming more and more difficult to make this happen. And again, I said there's Civil War animosities exist. I have no quotes from Texas herders. The Cowboys, there's no documentation of them voicing their contempt for settlers. Although you would have heard terms like nester to define a homesteader, or bean eaters. Bean eaters meaning Yankees. Those were derogatory terms. But these are quotes I pulled out of the local press at the time. The herders are like the rebels in the war. Every act of leniency or magnanimity on our part was treated as an act of cowardice by them. Justice is what these chaps need, and the only thing they are afraid of. The Omaha Bee said, they described the Cowboys as a parcel of lawless Texas herders who are a compound of whiskey, diabolism, and rebels, and who are the legitimate fruit of that spirit of evil engendered by the late rebellion. So people living here still have that memory of the Civil War in their minds. They fought guys from Texas. They didn't like them. And so now these cowboys are coming here, and these conflicts are starting to emerge. So here's our recipe for conflict in Kearney. The UP and the Burlington Railroad meet, creating Kearney Junction, where we sit today. However, markets are still available, specifically at Kearney and nearby Lowell. Lowell is southeast of here, 12 miles or so, on the Burlington line. The cattlemen are still occupying the Fort Military Reservation. At the same time that the railroaders and the speculators are trying to entice settlers to come out here. So the land's filling up. And really by the end of 1874, most of the good farming land directly around Kearney is settled. or owned by the railroad. Dobie-town, moving to Kearney, created quite a bit of problems because, one, when Kearney was in its infancy, it had yet to incorporate. And if you have it incorporated, you don't have a city council, you can't hire a sheriff, you can't pass ordinances. So you're sort of this unregulated village status almost. And that's going to create problems. And so those things all come together into fruition, and it's going to explode. It sort of simmers in 1873, and in 1874-75 we have problems. So the first full season that Kearney was in existence was 1873. That was the first full cattle season. The way it would work, herders would leave in the early spring from Texas. They would arrive in the Kearney area late May, early June most likely. Then they would put their herds on the Fort Kearney Military Reservation, fatten them up, either sell them at Kearney or at Lowell, or they would fatten them up and drive them north up to Fort Robinson or to the Pine Ridge and Rosebud reservations, sell them there. And then those groups of cowboys that came back from the reservations would stop in Kearney to rest up. Not quite a halfway point, but a place to stop. And as a result, we saw conflicts begin emerging. There was one incident where, and I haven't been able to really fully document it, but it comes out in the sources, and that's that the neighboring community of Lowell at one time or another was taken over by the Cowboys. No violence, but just sort of raucous behavior, riding through the streets, shooting weaponry, getting drunk, insulting the locals, and so forth. And so Kearney, which has grown much bigger, or is growing, and has an active press, begins writing critiques of the Cowboys, criticizing them. The Cowboys don't like it. They see this as an insult. So we'll begin seeing conflict between settlers, like what Frank Hamer did when he rolled up his sleeves, walked up to those Cowboys and said, "You boys better behave, or I'm going to fight you." Those are the things that are happening. And so no outright violence in the 1873 season. But the seed had sort of been sown. The Cowboys know now that we have this group in Kearney that are going to question us. They're going to try to bring our behavior into check. And here are some of the newspaper accounts that would have been put out in the local press. These Texas herders go swelling around through western portions of the state with their revolvers strapped on them as if they were in war times. And in fact, like all other cowards, they are only armed in times of peace. They are a terror to the settlers all over western Nebraska, and we understand there's strong talk of organizing and giving these desperados a little regulation. It is strange that the cattle dealers will hire such men and take them into a civilized community. It is a disgrace to our state, and the sooner these men are taught to behave themselves or sent to the penitentiary, the better. So this is in the newspaper, and it's an affront. It's a challenge to the Cowboys. Another one, the Texans compose for the most part the rowdy element in frontier towns. Unaccustomed to the restraints of society, they think laws are a nuisance and seem to delight in exhibition which show their utter contempt for laws. They drink rot-gut whiskey as naturally as duck takes to water. And when once fired up, ride through the streets yelling like demons, flourishing pistols and shooting around promiscuously. In fact, they make their bodies walking arsenals and take pleasure in a kind of bravado which passes for courage with them, but which is esteemed cowardice by us. They wear broad-brimmed hats, have long hair, and think they are devil of fellers generally. There are many number one fellows among the herders who come up the trail with cattle from Texas every season. Yet there are a few drinking, bowling, and desperate cusses among each outfit whose ambition it seems to be to shoot or cut somebody. And then finally, Texas herders and benzine make things lively at Junction. Right, benzine is like a turpentine, a really nasty substance that, equivalent to the rot gut whiskey that they may have been drinking. So that gets us to the season of 1874. 1873 we got through without any murders, conflict and such, but no murders. 1874 is going to be different. In 1874, Kearney incorporated. They knew the cattlemen were coming. They incorporated, they created a city council. They hired a city marshal. And they passed a series of ordinances, such as banning concealed weapons, such as closing drinking establishments on Sundays, a host of different things like that. Well, it took until into about September for August until things started bubbling to the forefront. What's going on here is the cattlemen, the herders were still coming into town, being boisterous, getting drunk, being a nuisance, but that lone sheriff, a guy by the name of Daniel Bricker, he was on his own, and he was kind of afraid to approach these guys. The citizens were putting pressure on him. You got to do your job. Finally, he does. In August, he arrests a cowboy who was wearing a gun on his holster here. His name was Richard Cole. Arrested him. It was a misdemeanor. The Omaha Daily Bee said Richard Cole was not accustomed to the ways of civilization, so he had to be arrested. But here we saw the first step towards the Kearney authorities arresting somebody. And then, again, I don't have the evidence, but what it's pretty clear what happened is the citizens themselves, perhaps those guys that had served in the Civil War, they essentially became a posse, or they allied with or helped out Marshal Bricker. So in mid-August, a cowboy by the name of Billy Bland, I've already talked a little bit about him, he's visiting Hattie McDonald's bordello. It was kind of just right along a railroad on the south side of the streets. He and 3 other cowboys were there. They were being boisterous, being out of control, and Bricker gets up the nerve and approaches him, or he's approaching the bordello, when Billy Bland comes out with his pistol, shoots several shots, more than likely over their heads. It was Bricker and several citizens, and they immediately returned fire. Billy Bland was hit. 2 others were hit, and a couple others escaped. One of them, Tom Peeler, was wounded and was left there. He survives, but is permanently disabled for the rest of his life. Billy Bland is wounded, and he makes his way to Lowell, hops a train, gets to Kansas City to get medical attention, and then in time to join the cattle herding season of 1875 and 76. He kills a fellow herder out in Oglala in 1876, and in 1877 he never makes it back to Nebraska because he's killed in a gunfight at Fort Griffin, Texas. That's the end of Billy Bland. Several weeks later, some of Billy Bland's compatriots, a guy by the name of John Spencer, who went by the nickname Texas Spence, he and several others came back to sort of avenge this shooting. You know, what are these Kearneyites doing standing up to us? They came back, they rode through the towns, shooting into windows, just being a general nuisance in general. When Marshal Bricker and his newfound friends, the citizens of Kearney, they actually returned fire and forced Texas Spence and his group out of town. The following day, Texas Spence comes back again. This time they're looking for Marshal Bricker, is what the evidence suggests. They are met with opposition. They're driven, at this time they're on the north side of town, and they're driven back across the tracks. They gather about 20 other cowboys right around where the courthouse is today, and their plan is to sort of storm through town. They're going to storm across the tracks into the business section, the north side of the tracks. And as they're riding towards town in mass, Kearney citizens led by Marshal Bricker return fire. They stop this charge. Texas Spence is dropped from his saddle. The other guys escape. And in the throes of all this, what happens is Texas Spence is laying on the ground. It seems as though he's reaching for his revolver, and somebody dispatches him. Texas Spence is killed right down on Central Avenue, right by the railroad tracks. Well, at this point, rumors are that the Cowboys are congregating. They're all across the Fort Kearney military reservation. They're grouping together, and they are going to make a raid on town. And everybody's fearful. Here's sort of where it all happens. So this is modern day Central Avenue. Here's the railroad tracks. These gunfights that I just explained to you all took place in sort of this general area here. I haven't quite been able to identify it, but what I think is the vice industries, where the prostitutes were, was over in this area. There were several saloons here, and then over here as well. And so that's sort of the scene of what's happening. Well, in the... Oh, let me read these to you. These are kind of fun. So these are all these different raids, those riding through the streets, the shootings, the drinking, the carousing and stuff. These are reports from local citizens on how they viewed it. No depredation was of too mean or cowardly nature for them to commit. But as bad as they were on ordinary occasions, it was when they visited the town of Kearney that their diabolical nature was shown at its worst. You've got to remember here, these are exaggerated. There's hints of truth in them, but we're making the story sound a lot better than it was. Half drunk and crazed with liquor, the Cowboys roamed down Wyoming Avenue, shooting right and left, destroying windows and storefronts and frightening everyone. The only course was to take refuge under or behind anything available and wait for the danger to pass. I've seen this written in several occasions, so a version of this more than likely happened. These cowboys were expert marksmen and horsemen, and nothing more delighted them than to ride into a saloon, demand the drinks at gunpoint or of a revolver, and then go forth and shoot up the town. That one's probably an exaggeration, but again, some kernel of it probably happened. Fun things to read, but we're kind of running out of time. These are newspaper articles of what I had just explained, the Kearney Raid, with Billy Bland and Texas Spence and so forth. So these appeared in different papers. Here this one says, Kearney cattle herders shooting again, citizens return fire, one herder mortally and another slightly. Bloodshed, Texan bullwhacking bummers on the rampage at Kearney. They storm the town and 2 bloody battles ensue between them and citizens. The Kearney riot. Remember, this is in Chicago, in the Chicago newspaper. The riotous Texan herders supposed to have fled the country. And outlawry in Nebraska. Well, this is what happens then. As this just happened, remember, the townspeople are fearing this incredible raid that's going to take place. The Texans wanted nothing to do with it. They pack up and they go home. But there was this threat that they would come. They would come back. And so they guarded the Platte River the bridge. They guarded all the entrances to town. They called on the governor to send out the troops, which didn't happen. And they also called on the governor to deliver arms to the armory. The city council published this in the newspaper. All persons found guilty of raiding and shooting on the streets, gambling, opening saloons on the Sabbath, carrying concealed weapons, will do so at their own peril, and may expect to be severely dealt with. All law-abiding citizens are called upon, and they are hereby authorized to put down all crimes of this nature. So now the city council's getting involved. They're calling on the authorities to enforce the laws, and they're calling on the people to unite. And in doing so, Kearney creates a militia unit called the Kearney Guards. This was authorized at the state level. It was led by 2 Civil War officers, E.C. Calkins and our old friend Colonel Rowe. And they will then use this unit to essentially protect the town and eventually serve as a posse. Okay, that brought the season of 1874 to an end. Now we have the cattle season of 1875. Several things have happened. One, the cattlemen, the owners of the cattle herds down in Texas, they say, well, what are we doing here? We don't want to fight Kearneyites. Let's go somewhere else. So they push most of their herds out to North Platte and Oglala. So there's not as many herds coming into Kearney. The Fort Kearney Reservation is in the process of being decommissioned, and the federal government's going to hand it over to the public domain, where it will be open to homesteaders. So that land's is not really so much available anymore. And so we don't see the conflicts in 1875 early on, but it will rise again. In September of 1875, a young man by the name of Ed Smith, he appears in Kearney. Nobody's ever seen him before. He's by himself. He's visiting the saloons in town, and he's dressed like a cowboy. And he's acting like a cowboy. He's trying to, in many ways, be Billy Bland or Texas Spence, and he's not. What happens is the authorities are fearing that this is another threat to the town. They arrest Ed Smith. It's a new marshal at this time, Marshal Simpson. Bricker got out. But Marshal Simpson is escorting him to the local lockup. He had started on the south side of the tracks, and for whatever reason, I don't know why he did this, he left Ed Smith on his horse, and he was escorting him, holding onto the horse, and taking him to the north side of the tracks. As soon as they'd crossed over the railroad, this is on Central Avenue today, what we think happened is the horse reared up, and the marshal took this as a threat and believed that Ed Smith was turning on him to shoot him, and the marshal stepped back and popped 2 rounds into Ed Smith. He fell off his horse. He stumbled to a building. He was bleeding out, and he died several hours later. The way it turned out, as the evidence unfolded, he wasn't a cowboy. He'd work on a cattle ranch out in Plum Creek, but he was just a young kid who was trying to, be with bravado, kind of act like a cowboy. What it showed, though, is the tension that was in town. We were still fearing those herders, those cowboys, and poor Ed Smith paid the price for it. Well, in September of 1875, Jordan Doc Smith will appear in town. I should step back. Doc Smith had actually come through town in June of 1875 with a herd of 3,000 cattle. They briefly rested at the Fort Kearney Military Reservation. Then he and his crew pushed these cattle up to Pine Ridge Reservation, sold them to government contractors, and they worked their way back down through the sandhills. They get to the first sort of town, the first sign of civilization, Kearney Junction, and they stop for the night. And they're going to stay there for a few days. They encamp on the south side of the river on the Fort Kearney Reservation. They corral their horses. There's 40, 50 horses. They corral them and go to town. So they're in town and having a good time. They're at Hattie McDonald's Bordello. They're in the saloons. Meanwhile, the horses get loose, and they trample the crops of Milton Collins, the son of one of Kearney's founders. Milton Collins is smart. He knows the herd law. He and his neighbors corral up those horses, 25 of them, and they're going to wait to collect damages from the herders. Well, here's what's going on. I'm going to make a long story short here because we're about out of time. The herders are in town drinking, very intoxicated. Milton Collins is doing what he thinks he should do. He hasn't heard any, he had put out word that he had the horses and wanted the payment. He hadn't heard back from the Cowboys. He starts coming into town to meet up with them when he runs into Jordan Smith and several of his Cowboys. I should point out real quick, look at the names here. Doc Smith, Roxy Copeland, Bernardino Roach, Mexican Joe, Coley Matthews. It reflects that integrated nature of cattle groups. There's 2 African Americans, there's clearly a Hispanic herder, there's an Indian herder, and then a couple of others. Well, in the course of this confrontation, witnesses had said that Jordan Smith, who's just falling down drunk at this point, they say they had to lift him up and put him onto his horse, and he can barely stay on. He had said a number of different quotes, stuff such as, "I'll have those ponies or I'll spill blood. I'm going to kill someone before the day is over." And he was rumored as saying, "We're going to clean out the damn Kearneyites to a man." So he's got something in him. He's fired up, he's drunk, he wants his horses. Well, he meets Collins on this road. This is Central Avenue, south of the modern-day courthouse, but that's the old courthouse. This would have been the main thoroughfare. Milton Collins lived at the end of this road where it butted into where the old Platte River Bridge was. And so Milton Collins' farm is essentially on top of Interstate 80 today. But they meet, these 2 groups, and Doc Smith pulls out a revolver, puts it to Milton Collins' head, and begins threatening him. He says stuff such as Collins is trying to explain himself, explain the herd law, he'll say, "Don't say another word or I'll blow your damn brains out. Say another word so I can shoot you," trying to intimidate him. He tells Milton Collins, "I'll wear out my pistol on your head." And he again says, "I'll have my ponies or I'll have your blood." So here's what happens. A real chaotic scene appears as this group, 3 cowboys, Milton Collins and one of his friends were there. They arrive at the farmstead, and there's agitation. The neighbors begin sensing something's wrong, and two brothers with the last name of Crowell, they make their way to the farm. Leonidas Scholes is guarding the horses in the corral, and Milton's father, Asbury, is making his way in the buggy to the farm. Moreover, Milton's young wife and newly born baby are sitting there in the farm. And there's this real confusion. Nobody knows what's happening. The cowboy is telling Milton Collins to get off his horse. No, don't get off your horse. Get off your horse. Don't get off your horse. He's confused. And in doing so, Milton Collins tries to get off his horse and protect himself. And Jordan Smith unloads 6 shots. He was so drunk he only hit him once. Unfortunately, it hit his elbow, ricocheted into his cavity, and he hit an artery, and Milton Collins bled out in a few minutes on the floor of his house. At this time, all hell's breaking loose. Asbury Collins, the father, arrives, and he's agitated. He's threatening Smith. The Cowboys have their guns on the father. The wife is crying and in shambles, obviously. She runs over to the father-in-law and wraps herself around him to protect him. The neighbors are approaching with guns. And other cowboys have heard this commotion. They've come across the bridge, and they're holding guns on everybody. So real chaotic scene. Finally, they release the horses. The cowboys as a group escape across the Platte River bridge. I should point out, though, they get to the bridge, and there's a buggy getting ready to cross, and they apparently very nicely asked, could you wait for a minute? and to let all the horses pass through. Okay, so I've got to really do some shortcuts here. Long story short, here's what happens. The Cowboys decamp. They at first try to escape into the Republican River Valley, and realizing we're on the open plains here, we've got to hide. So they turn west and get into the sandhills of Phelps County, and then eventually into the Platte River Valley where there's timber and islands and so forth. Posses, the newly created Kearney Guards, organize. They head into the Republican River Valley. Another group heads up the Platte Valley. Meanwhile, the Telegraph has let North Platte know and Plum Creek know. Posses are organizing from there, and they catch them, obviously. There's nowhere to go. It's the Great Plains. They find them. There was briefly talk of just let's lynch these SOBs, right? We know they killed them. Obviously, cooler heads prevailed, and they're brought back into Kearney, and now the legal system takes over. Just like I had argued in my earlier books, I was right there. Wrong about the violence, but the legal system takes over. That just outlines the shooting that took place. Well, there were 3 trials. Turns out Jordan Smith was from a very wealthy family. The herds he was pushing up, and by the way, his twin brother was with another herd in Nebraska at the same time. Very wealthy family. They hired the best lawyers. What happens at the first trial, we got to decide which of these cowboys are we going to prosecute and which aren't we. Jordan Smith, the shooter, is put on trial for first-degree murder. Bernardino Roach and Frederick Copeland, they were there when the shooting took place. They're tried as accessories. And J.D. Cooper, who was Jordan Smith's second-hand man, he turned state's evidence, and he becomes a witness for the prosecution. The other guys, the other 7 or 8 of them, they just decide their crimes, whatever they did there, don't warrant punishment, or we don't have the evidence. They're released. So a speedy first trial right here in Kearney. And Jordan Smith's convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to hang. The other 2 accessories, Roach and Copeland, they're acquitted. Not enough evidence. So it's just the one guy. Well, his lawyers eventually, this goes up to the Nebraska Supreme Court, and it's overturned because the judge failed to allow the jury to use drunkenness as an excuse. I don't understand that at all, but because that was not allowed to be one of the judgments, it's overturned. Goes back to the district court. This time it's in Lowell. Change of venue. You can't have a trial here, right? I should have pointed out in the first trial, the jurors were all selected for, you had to live 10 miles outside of Kearney Junction so that there would be an unbiased jury pool. Well, in the second trial, he's convicted. This time they allow the evidence of alcohol use, of being drunk. He's convicted of second-degree murder, sentenced to 30 years. Once again, he's sent to Lincoln. He's in the state pen holding while his lawyers work on it again. It's overturned. Some issues with the jury pool itself were a violation. It goes back to the courts again. Meanwhile, I mean, he has deep pockets. Now we're looking at the third trial. It's February 1877. It's in Juniata. Here's the problem. This is a frontier community. People are moving. It's a fluid community. Witnesses are gone. Isabel Collins, the young wife, died in 1876. J.D. Cooper, the star witness, he's disappeared into the cattle world. Nobody's there. And evidence suggests, we don't have a smoking gun on this one, but evidence suggests that there was some tampering with the jury. In other words, jurors being paid off because this family had so much money. He is convicted only of manslaughter, though. Apparently, the whole jury, other than two of them, wanted to acquit him. Two jurors simply held out and said, we will not, we will not, we will not. And so everybody agreed, okay, we'll give him manslaughter, and we will ask for leniency from the court. Well, now sitting on the court is our terror to evildoers, Judge Gaslin. And he gives him the maximum possible sentence, 10 years in prison. So that's how that case ends. If I had time, I would share this with you, but the Nebraska Advertiser interviewed him while he was in jail. He was repentant. He said, Jordan said, it was whiskey that made me do it. I don't remember anything. I'd never drank before in my life. And all these excuses. But here's his mugshot. They've shaved him down, right? If you go back and look, there he is. Young man, 23 years old, twin brother. He only served 7 of his 10 years because he was a model prisoner. He was released under what was called the Good Time Act, an early form of parole. Now, for me, this story was over because this guy walked out into history, right? Released from the prison, released to history. I didn't know where he was anymore until, by chance, I went on a genealogy website. I was looking at a genealogy website for information on him and his brother, and his great-great-grandson was looking for historical information for his genealogy program. And so we communicated back and forth, and it appears Jordan Smith, after he's released, ends up in Montana, cattleman, gets married, has 5 or 6 kids. Strangely, there was a murder committed on his ranch at some point. He was never accused of it. And he dies natural causes in 1908. And there's him and his wife. So in a sense, a real sad story in a way. I mean, clearly a first-degree murder. I mean, he shot down Milton Collins, cold blood. He gets off with 7 years. He goes on to live not a long life. He died at 54 years old. Milton Collins' family's in shambles. Milton's killed at 23 years old. His wife dies the next year. His older brother's killed in a hunting accident 3 years later. And so a really sad story. I'm out of time here because I would like to have a few questions if possible.
Why did you choose to use the term cowboy if it wasn't appropriate for that date?
Great question. The question is, why did I choose the term cowboy instead of herder? I did that because all of us in the room and in general, people would understand cowboy more than herder. Herder takes a little bit of explanation, as would drover and buckaroo and so forth. So I just chose the contemporary term cowboy. But it's a great question, and more or less so that people would understand what I'm talking about. And by the 1880s, you start seeing cowboy used. Herder is still more common, but by the 1890s, 1900, cowboy is the more common term. And cowboy is more or less refers to those cowboys working on a working ranch. Herder is the guy who's moving livestock some other place. Yes, Mike Baldwin.
Yes, Dr. Ellis. What became of the Collins baby?
Mike asked, what became of the Collins baby? I don't know that question. I haven't peeled back the layers yet. Now, what did happen is Milton's mother and father they lived for a while, and Mother Collins, I don't remember what her name was. She lived well into the 20th century, and so I don't know if the baby. I don't know. Good question, Carol.
It sounded like there was a little bit of ambivalence in that call from the sheriff right after the Kearney War between a return to law and order and a return to, or a call for vigilante justice. Which way did it go?
Yeah, the question was, after the raid on Kearney, the newspapers were reporting both, let's be law-abiding, but let's organize and kick these people out, right? So a combination of legal-mindedness and also, we might just call it vigilantism. In some ways, those went hand in hand because local citizens were sort of expected, as we saw them do with Marshal Bricker, to step up and assist via serving in posses. And I guess what they eventually do to legitimize it all is they create the Kearney Guards that were sanctioned by the governor, and so now it was all legal. Even though they're private citizens sort of working to regulate the Cowboy Menace. Probably have time for one more question. Joe?
When they brought the cattle up, you said they went to the reservation. Did they also put them on the train to ship to like Chicago?
Yes, good question. The question was the cattle were driven to the Fort Kearney Military Reservation. The reason why that was is that they were put on the reservation to fatten up, graze on those grasses. Then they brought them to Kearney Junction or to Lowell, where they had an extra 40, 50 pounds on them and to get more money. Those cattle were then shipped to, more than likely, Chicago. This was a lot of fun, and I look forward to getting this book done and sharing it with everybody.